Today, we're having a brief look at the Soviet Union's first jet aircraft. Sort of. We're also looking at a steam-powered aircraft. Sort of. And we are looking at the aircraft that brought the Mikoyan and Gurevich Design Bureau back from building experimental test beds and into the world of actual production aircraft. Again, sort of. Right, let's start at the beginning, shall we? The Soviet Union was late to the party when it came to jet aircraft development, though not from a lack of enthusiasm from its engineers. And when it finally tried to catch up with the other major powers, that rush produced some truly weird, wonderful, and downright bizarre designs. Today we are looking at one of them, the I-250, which is sometimes erroneously called the MiG-13. Now, as this is an early Cold War, highly experimental Soviet aircraft, there isn't the best photographic record to go with this video, so please bear with me as I make use of what little photos I have been able to source, along with some drawings and the occasional use of a 3D model. Now, the basic idea of jet propulsion was nothing new to the Soviet Union by the end of the Second World War. As far back as 1903, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky had discussed the theory of jet propulsion. Then, in 1930, he published a paper outlining the potential benefits of jet propulsion for aircraft. He even predicted that the age of the propeller would eventually be followed by an age dominated by the jet engine. But Soviet leadership showed little interest in actually pursuing this technology. Instead, they preferred to focus on more conventional aircraft power plants, and after the outbreak of the Great Patriotic War, following the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, that preference became much stronger. Even when reports of German jet and rocket aircraft began to filter through in the winter of 1943, there was still no official funding for Soviet jet technology. That finally changed at the start of 1944, because both Britain and the United States publicly announced their own jet aircraft development programs. And with this, Stalin became rather furious. Apparently, he could tolerate his enemies having such a technological edge over him in their developments, but not his Western allies. On the 18th of February 1944, the State Committee for Defense, or GKO, summoned aircraft designers Lavochkin, Sukhoi, Yakovlev, and Mikoyan to Moscow. They were ordered to produce new jet-powered aircraft for the Soviet Union. They were also criticized for not having done so already. This demand, seemingly out of the blue, no doubt took most of them by surprise. But any senior Soviet official, still alive in 1944, knew better than to argue when told that A. Stalin was angry, and B. he wanted something incredibly complex done incredibly quickly, and they simply got to work. There was, however, one small itty-bitty problem, and that was the fact that the Soviet Union did not have a jet engine, not even close. Before the outbreak of the Great Patriotic War, Arkhip Lyulka and his team at the Kirov factory in Leningrad had been working on a turbojet, the VDR-2. By 1941, they had almost got it into a working state, but I'm sure the words 1941 and Leningrad in the same sentence are ringing a few bells for those of you that are historically inclined. It was not long before the factory was being shelled by the advancing German Wehrmacht, and Lyulka's team had to be evacuated. As a result, work on the turbojet was immediately suspended. Instead, later on, when they were set up in a new factory, the Soviet Union turned its attention to producing more conventional engines, especially those that were required for their tanks. Lyulka and his team would eventually restart work on their turbojet after receiving Stalin's orders, but in early 1944, their turbojet was nowhere near ready for operational use. In fact, the only jet power plant considered even remotely ready in the Soviet Union was the Air Reaction Auxiliary Compressor, or VRDK, and calling it a jet power plant is admittedly a bit of a stretch. That being said, this was a rather inventive system which had been in development at the Central Institute of Aviation Motors since 1942. The team was led by K.V. Kolshevnikov, and what they created was a strange hybrid system. It combined a traditional piston engine with a shaft-driven auxiliary compressor, a combustion chamber, and a jet exhaust pipe. In other words, it was a normal propeller-driven aircraft engine with a jet boost system bolted onto the back of it. The piston engine that was chosen for the task was the Klimov VK-107R, which was a supercharged liquid-cooled V12. This was closely related to the VK-107A, which would be fitted to the Yak-9U. Rated at 1,650 horsepower, it was all around a very powerful, if expensive to manufacture and maintain, power plant. But the key difference was that the VK-107R had an auxiliary drive shaft that was running out of the opposite side of the engine from the propeller shaft. When installed in the aircraft, it would operate as follows. During takeoff, about 95% of the engine's power was sent to the main propeller shaft, which drove a 3.1 meter diameter propeller. The rest went to driving the supercharger. So far, so normal. But once the aircraft was airborne and had built up enough speed, the pilot could choose to engage a clutch behind the crankshaft. This clutch connected to a 13:21 ratio gearbox, which in turn drove the auxiliary shaft which extended out of the rear of the engine. That shaft powered a compressor which was mounted inside an air duct leading towards the main radiator. A small secondary duct also branched off from this system, and this is what was used to feed air from the main air intake at the nose that was required by the supercharger. Now, because of the nature and layout of this system, air was always flowing through these ducts. But when the compressor was activated, the airflow increased dramatically. That increased the engine's power through the supercharger, but it also increased the flow of the cooling air through the main duct that was passing over the radiator. Still, so far, so sane. But this is where the VRDK system starts to become rather more interesting. Around the radiator itself is a sort of set of grills or honeycombs that turns the airflow into a more twisting and turbulent state. Immediately behind the radiator was a set of 7 nozzles. These sprayed fuel from the main fuel tank directly into this now turbulent but still compressed airflow. A little further downstream from that, spark plugs would then ignite this mixture in what was essentially a rudimentary combustion chamber, and then this hot, expanding gas was allowed to exit through an exhaust nozzle at the rear of the aircraft, producing thrust. So, in essence, this was a tiny compressor-driven jet engine, minus the turbine, attached to the back of a propeller aircraft. These days, this type of system is commonly referred to as a motor jet. And then, because of course, there was one final feature which initially sounds a bit ludicrous, and that is steam power. Most of the ducting in the system was made from aluminium, but because of the high temperatures involved, the combustion chamber itself had to be made from stainless steel. And to stop the combustion chamber from baking or simply melting the surrounding fuselage skin of the aircraft, water would be sprayed onto the inner walls of the chamber from a 78-litre tank. This water then evaporated into steam, and that steam acted as a sort of insulating cushion, sitting between the hot gases and the walls of the combustion chamber itself. It also had another benefit in that it increased the pressure inside the system and therefore helped to increase the thrust by a bit. So yes, this was a jet engine, sort of, and it owed part of its power output to good old-fashioned steam power. Kind of. And you thought I was done talking about steam engines after my lecture on early era engine development. Oh no, it always finds a way to come back in one way or another, but I digress. Bench testing and theoretical calculations suggested that this system, when operated at an altitude of 7,000 meters, would produce between 330 to 365 kilograms of thrust. This meant that the combined system, the piston engine and the motor jet, would produce the equivalent of 2,600 horsepower. So the VRDK system added an extra 1,000 horsepower onto the power of the existing power plant. By mid to late 1944, this whole arrangement had been thoroughly tested in static form. Now it just needed to be bolted into an aircraft. And that is where Sukhoi and the MiG Design Bureau step in. The Sukhoi aircraft I'll cover in another video and just stick with the MiG one for the time being. Now, up until this point, MiG had spent much of the war essentially producing a variety of test beds. As a result, they were actually quite well placed to work out how best to get this experimental power plant into the air, and they quickly began work on something called Project N, and this would soon receive the official designation of I-250. Because their aircraft would have to withstand the high thrust of this unusual engine arrangement, and the high engine combustion temperatures involved, MiG used an entirely stressed skin structure with no wooden components and a welded steel cradle that would hold the engine. This was, in fact, the Bureau's first all-metal aircraft, which is saying something considering it's 1944. But because the aircraft was being designed under immense time pressure, Stalin was not a very patient man, the rest of the design was fairly conventional. The wing used a standard 10% Sagi laminate airfoil, and it was supported by 2 spars and plate ribs. It also had Sagi slotted flaps that were fitted, along with freeze-type ailerons, but there were no leading-edge slats. Since the VRDK system was expected to be, shall we say, somewhat temperamental, maintenance access was also a priority. Because of this, removable cowling panels were fitted, the entire tail unit could be detached, and fuel would be carried in 3 self-sealing fuel tanks. There was a 415-litre tank in the fuselage and a 100-litre tank in each wing. Now, given that all of this sat ahead of a system that was part combustion chamber and part afterburner, and completely experimental, self-sealing fuel tanks were probably a fairly sensible precaution. Although the I-250 used a conventional tail dragger undercarriage, the Design Bureau couldn't resist adding a little innovation here to go with the unusual power plant. The arms that were carrying the main wheels bent forward from the landing gear legs themselves. This gave the aircraft a rather distinctive appearance whilst taxiing around on the ground. MiG also claimed that, for the first time in the Soviet Union, the wheel bays were faired over both when the undercarriage was retracted and when it was extended. They were only exposed while the gear was actually cycling, and this helped with streamlining. The tail wheel was much simpler. It was simply a castering unit which retracted into a fairing beneath the jet nozzle during flight. In terms of general arrangement, the more eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that the pilot has quite a bit of plane between him and the nose. To balance the center of gravity of the unusual power plant, the cockpit had to be positioned behind the wings by a considerable distance. This gave the aircraft a noticeable resemblance to the earlier MiG-1, and not to mention various racing aircraft from the interwar period. It also meant that the pilot's field of view in certain directions was, shall we say, limited, particularly on the ground and during the approach for landing, which could prove to be quite dangerous. Not only did you have 2/3 of the aircraft in front of you, but your downward view was also hampered by the monoplane wing. However, in lieu of the increased power output, this was deemed an acceptable compromise by those who would never have to fly it. A full mock-up was completed by October of 1944, it was officially approved on the 26th, and the first prototype, N number 1, rolled out of the factory 4 months later on the 26th of February 1945. Happily, the few photographs that do exist of this prototype are very easy to identify thanks to its stark white paint scheme. Unhappily, there's about 4 or 5 of a quality good enough for this video, so I'll be cycling between them quite a bit moving forward. Although this prototype was only a testbed, it was fitted with a remarkably potent armament, as this would be the intended configuration for it if it was brought into service. The fighter would carry 3 20mm Shavrov B-20 cannons. One fired through the propeller hub, and the other 2 were mounted besides the crankcase, and each gun had 160 rounds of ammunition. MiG test pilot A.P. Dayev was chosen to take the aircraft up for its maiden flight, and this took place on the 3rd of March 1945. This made the I-250 the first Soviet aircraft to fly while at least partially powered by jet propulsion. Sukhoi followed 1 month later with the Su-5, which, as mentioned earlier, used the same power plant. Now, Dayev's first impression was how incredibly noisy it was when the VRDK system was running. And when it was switched off, the aircraft had considerably worse performance than contemporary machines due to the extra weight. But, ear-ringing noise aside, when the system was turned on, the aircraft's performance was noticeably better. Early claims stated that the prototype was 100 km an hour faster than any piston engine aircraft then in existence. And, on the 23rd of May, Dayev pushed the I-250 up to 825 km per hour, or an airspeed of 445 knots. Artem Mikoyan, head of the MiG Design Bureau, was thoroughly delighted with these results. He was so delighted, in fact, that he awarded Dayev with his own prized personal car, which, in Soviet Russia in 1945, was not exactly a small gift. This was a very promising start for this strange little steampunk fighter, but pushing the boundaries of aviation often comes at a cost, and alas, this would be no exception. In mid-May, during another test flight, Dayev was attempting to determine the prototype's maximum speed at low altitudes. It's not known quite how fast he was going, but he pulled up sharply out of a high-speed pass at an altitude of just 250 meters. As he did so, part of the horizontal stabilizer was seen to flutter and then partially disintegrate and detach from the rest of the tail. The prototype became uncontrollable and Dayev was able to immediately bail out, but he bailed out far too low. His parachute didn't have time to fully deploy and he was killed on impact. The prototype, of course, was destroyed. The loss deeply shook the MiG Design Bureau. It was especially painful for Artem Mikoyan, who had been a close friend of Dayev for some time. Years later, Mikoyan would erect a monument dedicated to Dayev and all the other MiG test pilots who lost their lives in the pursuit of advancing aviation. But despite the tragedy, there could be no pause to development. After the crash, changes were made to the second prototype, which was inventively named N No. 2. Its tail surfaces were redesigned and significantly strengthened, and for the sake of expediting further test flights, the weapons were initially left off this second prototype, and it was also given a very different paint scheme. It was painted blue with a pair of yellow stripes down the side. The second prototype made its maiden flight just 2 weeks after the loss of the first. Test pilot A.P. Yakimov took Dayev's place at the controls, and almost immediately it nearly ended in another disaster. Yakimov took off, but the aircraft failed to gain altitude. Instead, it slowed, banked hard, and flew a very short, panicked circuit before making an emergency landing. Once safely back on the ground, Yakimov explained that he had encountered severe control problems only seconds after takeoff. A thorough investigation followed, and fortunately the cause was not a fundamental design flaw in the second prototype, it was merely a mistake done in the factory with the installation of the tail control surfaces. This problem was quickly corrected, and the second maiden flight, by comparison, was blissfully uneventful. Unfortunately, this is pretty much where the second prototype's good luck ends. In mid-October 1945, it was almost wrecked when its oil system failed towards the end of a long high-altitude test flight. The test pilot, A.N. Chernobrov this time, had to shut down the engine before it destroyed itself, but he was too far away from his airfield, and he had to make an emergency landing in the southern outskirts of Moscow. Problems with the oil system hampered testing for several months. The engine had to be replaced twice due to metal shavings being found in the oil filter, and it often overheated. Poor quality manufacturing was the root cause. Not just in the oil system though, but the piston engine and the VRDK system as well. This led to numerous flight test mishaps, and by the summer of 1946, the prototype had been tested with numerous oil radiators and oil filters, none of which seemed to be working. Then, to add insult to injury, an engine defect caused a fire on the 12th of July 1946, which once again forced the prototype down into yet another emergency landing. This one was much harder though, and it sustained serious damage to the undercarriage, which collapsed, the lower fuselage, and the wing structures. It was technically repairable, but the Ministry of Aviation deemed that to repair it would be an impractical allocation of resources. By this point, attention was already shifting onto other projects that would utilize the turbojet as their primary power plant. But this was not quite the end of the I-250 story, because a small number would be built. That being said, I am going to keep this fairly simple here, as I'm going into a lot more detail in a later video about the USSR's early jet development programs. And yes, it is insane, as many of you probably suspect, perhaps even more so. According to some sources, such as Putnam's MiG aircraft since 1937 by Bill Gunston and Yefim Gordon, back in June 1945, an emergency program was ordered to build 10 I-250s in time for the October Revolution parade in Red Square. MiG engineers worked frantically to complete the aircraft in less than 4 months. Somehow they were ready on time, and they even made what was described as an incredibly loud and low-level practice pass. And then, after all that effort, the parade was cancelled because of bad weather. So, in true Stalinist fashion, work on developing the production aircraft had been delayed for a publicity stunt that never actually happened. But, and this is a big, thick, curvaceous but as usual, that is probably not the true version of events. A pre-production series of 10 aircraft were ordered, and it appears that it was hoped that they would feature in some sort of parade, but pretty much every source I've checked gives a different version of events. What I can say is that most sources agree that delivery of these machines fell far behind schedule. This was for several reasons, but chiefly because the factories responsible for the power plant and cooling systems did not meet their deadlines at all. Supporting factories repeatedly failed to supply flight-ready power plants, leaving 7 finished airframes sitting idle without engines as late as July of 1946, 12 months after the initial order was placed. When engines were delivered, they frequently suffered from defects like broken compressor blades, failing seals, and scorched cables, while their short service life, which was less than 25 hours by the way, necessitated constant time-consuming repairs. Additionally, manufacturing complexity also severely hampered production at factory number 381, which was the factory responsible for airframe assembly. The factory struggled to transition from building wooden aircraft to the I-250's all-metal construction, which required high precision tolerances. Poor quality control led to the discovery of serious structural defects, such as the use of incorrect steel for bolts and improperly drilled holes, forcing the factory to rebuild 7 sets of wings from scratch. This was exacerbated by continuous design revisions being issued by the Design Bureau, owing to the aforementioned troubled testing program of the second prototype. In total, they added something like 350,000 extra man-hours to the project, which was the equivalent to building 6 extra airframes. Severe resource shortages and political friction, because of course, further derailed the delivery schedule. The factory lost over half of its production workforce, some 1,700 out of 3,000 workers, and significant equipment during a facility transfer, while crippling power and fuel rationing caused nearly 200,000 man-hours of downtime. Now, the failure to meet the Soviet leadership's unrealistic deadlines, of course, resulted in some high-level fallout, including the arrest of the Minister of Aviation Industry and the factory director, on charges of industrial sabotage, of course, because clearly the fact that they were given an impossible task was not reason enough to fail. Ultimately, the first complete aircraft, so a machine that was actually given a functioning power plant and could take off and fly under its own power, was not accepted until August of 1946. Eventually, 9 of the 10 aircraft ordered were supposedly ready to take part in a parade flyover for November of 1946, not 1945, and that supposedly was the parade that was cancelled due to poor weather. Interestingly, despite all of the chaos with building the pre-production series and the growing disinterest in the motorjet engine, the I-250 did still receive a production order, just an extremely limited and brief one. In late 1946, the Soviet Naval Air Force placed an order for some I-250s from Factory 381. Sources differ on exactly how many were ordered. The figure seems to be somewhere between 16 and 50 aircraft, but records are unclear. Sources also differ, unsurprisingly, as to whether or not even a single one of these was produced and delivered at all. Despite some published textbooks claiming that a limited number entered service as the so-called MiG-13, the majority of textbooks and resources and other sources that I've found state, in one way or another, that the I-250 was later rejected by the Soviet Naval Air Force during its pre-service assessments. The Navy wanted it as a potential long-range escort, which was an incredibly optimistic goal. This would require modifications to increase the range of the aircraft by increasing its fuel capacity, which is fair enough, but also increasing its engine endurance, which was probably going to be a bit more of a challenge. This, in turn, would take the projected takeoff weight from 3,028 kilograms to 3,931 kilograms without any further increase in power. I think you can see where we're going with this. It wasn't really going to work, but they were somehow pushing for this anyway. There was one small silver lining in the redesign, in that apparently directional stability was meant to be improved by a redesigned vertical stabilizer and rudder. However, it is unclear if any of these modifications were carried out on anything other than static test models or a wind tunnel scale model. An existing I-250 was given to the Soviet Navy for testing, but it quickly revealed that its issues had not been resolved at all. Engine problems, oil leaks, repeated gear failures, which is not ideal for anything that might be stuck on a carrier one day, and the Russian climate's proclivity for uncooperation meant that between October of 1947 and January of 1948, the I-250 aircraft given to the Navy logged only 6 flights, totaling just over 2.5 hours of flight time. The engine proved to be so damn problematic that the VRDK system was only activated once, on the ground, for about 1.5 minutes. Unsurprisingly, in April 1948, the I-250 was officially declared to have failed its trials, and that was the end of it. With the arrival of the first Soviet turbojet aircraft, there was literally no reason for this aircraft to exist, and it's likely that all remaining I-250s were scrapped shortly afterwards. And really, when you take a step back and look at the whole thing for more than a few moments, the I-250 was quite frankly doomed from the outset. It was only meant to be a stopgap, a way to get some sort of jet-powered aircraft into the air before Uncle Stalin got a bit too gulag happy. It was rushed, it was complicated, and in the end it only offered a moderate advantage over a highly developed supercharged piston engine fighter. By the time the last I-250 had been completed, its own designers had already given up on it, because the MiG Design Bureau had already flown its first successful turbojet aircraft, the MiG-9. But that is a story for another day. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members who help keep this channel going. Alrighty, so videos are back on after my wedding-induced hiatus. Another one is due out this weekend, a deep dive is in the works, and there's about half a dozen other videos that are being lined up for the next month, so your patience is being rewarded. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier supporters, our highest tier members, and a warm welcome to Frederick Barnett and Raxon, who are the newest members of this special group. Work is progressing on the Patreon and YouTube member videos that have been requested, and a few will be coming out towards the end of this month and in the first week or two of August, along with the first part of a highly requested video topic. What could it be? Well, you will find out. But anyways, that is all for today. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.